Hello, in this video I'm going to start a new series talking about another author that is really important and linked to a lot of like post-structuralism and postmodernism, which is Michel Foucault and the arguments that Michel Foucault is making about biopolitics. If you don't know, Michel Foucault is a philosopher from France and a historian that was alive during like the early 20th and mid 20th century all the way until like 1984, 85, and wrote a lot of things about various political theories and really developed this concept of both the Panopticon and biopolitics, along with a bunch of other different theories and ideas that I'm really excited to talk to you all about in this series. I think that biopolitics is a really interesting concept in debate because biopolitics is all over the place and in so much literature. Arguments that you see about population management, arguments that you see about the management of life, etc., especially from a critical standpoint, are usually somehow really tied up in with the arguments that Foucault is making. And a lot of the arguments that Foucault has made about power, acknowledgement, control, and punishment have carried through like various forms and places of study from like all types of fields. And so I think it's critically really important to really understand Foucault regardless of what type of debate that you do, if you do policy or if you do critical, because there's so much arguments that are like politically important and that are just really good ideas to consider when doing debate, I think, when really thinking about some of the philosophy of Michel Foucault. And so I want to talk about some of their arguments here. And so to start, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the idea of a panopticon, and then I kind of want to talk about biopolitics. And those are kind of like start as maybe some of the ideas that I use to guide a lot of the conversations I'll be having in this video. Definitely check out a lot of the other concepts that Foucault outlined in like the study of sexuality, or a lot of the other writings that Foucault has done in terms of various subjects discussing like human subject formation, the way that we think about like how we kind of like come to think about ourselves and various identity performance. And I'll definitely touch on some of those ideas in this video, but I definitely think if you want the full context, you should definitely go just read through a lot of their literature and see how like people are referring to them and using their studies of like sexuality and people, etc., in order to really make reflections on like a host of different fields of study that I think are really, really important to a lot of the stuff that we're kind of talking about now, and also will be incredibly important on the water resolution, which will be some of what I'm talking about at the end of this video. So to start off with Foucault and start thinking about maybe some of the central arguments that really frame Foucault's writings, I want to talk about two things and two ideas that will kind of structure a lot of the lectures that I'll be giving on this topic, and that things will kind of stretch from, which is the idea of the Panopticon and like what that means in terms of like population management and the way populations manage themselves and surveillance technologies, etc. And then I also want to talk about biopolitics, or the idea of the management of life and the management of like who gets to live as a way to think about like how we think about political power and stuff like that. And I think these concepts are critically important regardless of like what kind of standpoint you take in debate. So hopefully you're definitely tuned in and enjoying the stuff that I'll be doing for this. So in order to kind of like begin this conversation over what a panopticon is a way to think about a way of designing like a punitive system that Foucault was originally designing to talk about prisons. It was a picture that was basically used to talk about like a prison that would like be surrounded. Think about a prison that would operate as like a huge circle with one tower that kind of like comes out from the middle. At the top of that tower can kind of like see into every cell that's in the prison, because if the prison is like in a circle and all of the cells are like open or see through, then the like watchtower that's in the middle can like see into all of the different cells. Obviously if there's like one person in the watchtower, or like whoever is in the watchtower, they can't watch all the cells at the same time. But the point or the idea behind the panopticon is that the very idea that you could be watched, or that your cell is open to like being watched or looked in, is what stops prisoners from like breaking the rules or not following the rules of the law. And so Foucault is kind of using this conception of thinking about prisons as a way to think about society in general, and to think about the way in which various technologies of surveillance and various ways that like our like lives as people have become transparent through various technologies, as a way in which we think about the panopticon. And what Foucault's point is that the panopticon is meant to solicit a particular way for communities to act, and a way for subjects to kind of form themselves, because of the way that it imposes a kind of like watchman that is like always there but also not there, and is kind of omnipotent simply from the fact that like he's both untouchable and reachable by being like at the watchtower, and is also like could be there and also could not be there, and therefore is kind of like also always kind of soliciting this like peace of mind in order for us to kind of think about like how we're engaging the world and like what makes us like better or worse subjects. Additionally, when I'm thinking about like biopolitics as like a kind of larger like system of management that I think really goes hand in hand with thinking about the Panopticon. Biopolitics is like a terminology that was basically used to talk about a field of study that kind of like intersects between like human biology and human biology and politics. The idea was to talk about the ability to ensure, sustain, and multiply life, and to put life in order. What Foucault I think means by that is the way in which life becomes managed by various forms of politics. When you think about like for instance on the water resolution, the idea of like what communities have access to water is a statement about like what communities have in terms of access to the resources necessary to live. It's also a statement in the type of like power that communities have in their ability to manage themselves. All of these things are biopolitical questions because they ask the question about how populations are managed in the context of like how they exercise life. For Foucault, basically biopolitics like is a particular type of governance that is about regulating populations through biopower, which is the application of biopolitics and political power to all forms of life. If you think about like how this actually gets transmuted and how we think about like how biopolitics gets engaged, it is through the ability for like biopower to be instilled by like various forms and technologies of power that are kind of like spoken about along the same type of technology as the Panopticon. And so in that sense, you can think about the presence of various surveillance technologies that exist in the world now, whether you're thinking about like cameras or you're just thinking about the prevalence of like various types of ad techniques, etc., and other types of data gathering technologies. They all kind of serve as this kind of panoptic power that like reminds us of the presence of biopolitics and the ability of our lives to kind of be regulated by various forms of like political power. I think that this is critically important for the affirmative and the negative, especially on the water resolution, because water is such a key resource to how we think about what populations have access to like equitable sources of living and like sources of living that actually sustain and help those communities. That like I think asking questions about who gets water and like how they get water and like what types of technologies are used to ensure and execute that process are critical questions being asked about like biopolitics and biopower and the way that it gets implemented as a whole. I think on the affirmative, this opens up like a host of affirmatives that you can read that are all just about kind of disarticulating the ability of the panoptic system and for biopower to really drive the way in which we gear ourselves as subjects. I think a lot of the alternatives to this just looks like ways of just kind of proliferating alternative performances that don't rely on being like valued or devalued under the current system that kind of engages us within like panoptic surveillance or that imposes biopower into the way that we manage ourselves. I also think basically thinking about ways to destabilize the ways in which the government is able to regulate these resources and talk about various ways in which communities take up their own ways of thinking about addressing various sources of inequality can be a really good place for you to situate a lot of the arguments that you want to make on the affirmative in relationship to water, and can be an incredibly potent way for you to really attack this topic. And then I think on the negative, there are so many ways in which you can talk about population management and biopower as a part of like other types of criticisms and other types of questions of identity, of ways of thinking about social location and thinking about marginalization, because there are so many ways in which this particular study of biopolitics and race and biopolitics in relationship to political power has been used in order to talk about things like racism, to talk about things like homophobia, patriarchy, and I think that implementing those into various ways that you interrogate the affirmative method of population management in whatever the way they kind of think about the deployment of resources and the way in which that kind of like makes the state's ability to manage power stronger, then I think you have a really strong critique to really make a variety of arguments that touch various points of offense all over the affirmative. Hopefully this video was good as kind of a starter for you to start thinking about some ideas that come from Michel Foucault. If you're interested, hopefully you're also looking into some of the writing Michel Foucault is doing in order to get a better idea of some of the stuff that I'll be talking about in the rest of the videos, and hopefully you'll be tuned in for more. Thanks.